Good afternoon. Welcome to our special online discussion commemorating the 5th anniversary of the Truth and Reconciliation Report and where we're at on the 94 calls to action that it contained. I'm Melissa Ridgen. So what progress have we made since then over this 5 years, and what are the opportunities that we've missed? We've got a lot of voices today to share their perspectives on just this. Thank you to our audience for joining us as well for this important conversation. Let's get right to it. Kicking off our discussion today, we have Darian Baskowatang. He is currently a summer law student at Olthius Clare Townsend. Darian is from the White Sand First Nation and worked with the Premier of Ontario and the Office of the Prime Minister on matters including reconciliation. His interests are in Crown Indigenous relations, often focusing on Aboriginal rights and title, treaty rights, Indian Act measures, and related regulations. Also joining us is Kiana Alexander. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the Raven Institute. She joins us from Musqueam, unceded traditional territory in British Columbia. Kiana's Métis homelands are rooted in Fort Chip, Alberta. In 2019, Kiana was named WXN's Top 100 Most Powerful Women in Canada in the Future Leaders category. And the Future of Goods, that's in 2019, that was a list of 21 young impact leaders. Also with us, Michael Linklater. He's a band counselor with the Thunderchild First Nation. He's joining us from Saskatoon. He's a Cree father and a founder of Boys with Braids. He's also an accomplished basketball player, Inspire laureate, and a Saskatchewan Future 40 Under 40 leader. And Tanshay Redvers, she's a Dene Métis Two-Spirit social justice warrior, writer from Treaty 8 Territory, Northwest Territories. She's been named one of MTV and We Day's top 10 drivers of change in Canada, and is the co-founder of We Matter, a national organization dedicated to Indigenous youth hope and life promotion. So a powerhouse panel of young Indigenous minds here to discuss where we're at now 5 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Report and where we should be heading. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us.
As I was saying just before we got started here, I wish that we could all be sitting here in the same room having this discussion. It would be nice, and hopefully we're moving towards that in the future again, where people can gather and chat. So I want to ask each of you just quickly, a couple of sentences. How would you say, if you were to summarize it, how do you think the TRC changed Canada? We could start with you, Kiana. Oh, sorry, we'll fix Kiana's audio there. Darian, let's go to you. How did, if you were to summarize it for somebody who came from another planet, what was the change that TRC made on Canada?
Yeah, so I think really the TRC opened up everyone's eyes and gave insight to the human rights abuses that our kids had to endure simply because they were Indian. The importance of bringing to the light behind these the doors of the dark residential schools can't go understated, and it really told Canadians from coast to coast to coast what happened and what needs to change to rectify all these issues.
I like that. Tanshay,
are you there? Do we have you with us?
I am, yeah. I think just building on that a little bit is, the TRC calls to action, just like was stated, really brought awareness to the public what Canada has been hiding for so long, and really brought that to the forefront. And I think a lot of folks were really disappointed to know that so much of this information had been hidden in terms of, education and knowledge and what happens with Indigenous people in this country. So I thought it did a really good job at simply bringing awareness around, the history and present realities of Indigenous folks in Canada.
Yeah. Michael Linklater, what do you feel that the TRC changed for Canada?
I think what it was able to do was, for a lot of non-Indigenous people who may have been neutral about the situation or just unaware, it allowed them to become allies to Indigenous people and to help amplify the voice of the injustice that has happened to our people.
Excellent. I want to go back to Kiana and see if her audio is working out. Kiana, are you there? Can you hear us? She can hear us, but she can't talk. Oh, okay. Technology, right? So I want to ask, then we'll go back, we'll start with you. We'll go backwards this time. Tanshay, I want to know, are there calls to action within the 94 calls to action that you feel like are going to get skipped over or perhaps even forgotten as time goes on and they're not implemented?
Absolutely. I think, there are 94 calls to action, and, there is so much juice in this. Like, there is so much that needs to be done, and so much, that hasn't been done yet. Mm-hmm. And so
through
our work with We Matter, we specifically focus on Indigenous youth mental health and life promotion. And when it comes to mental health and suicide rates among Indigenous youth in Canada, these rates have not gone down. They have stayed stagnant. They have stayed the same. So I think we really need to reevaluate how much is being done in regards to these calls to action. And specifically, are we amplifying the voices of Indigenous young people? And I think that's one thing that we really need to look at moving forward, is how can we center the voices of Indigenous young people in this country, because they are the fastest growing. We are the fastest growing demographic in Canada. And, in years from now, we will be the dominant demographic. And so how can we bring those important, powerful Indigenous youth voices to the forefront, leading these conversations around reconciliation?
Yeah. Kiana, I understand that we've got Kiana's audio working again here. Her technical difficulties have been sorted out. Kiana, I wanted to just jump in. Sorry about the problem with the first question, but we'll just jump into where we are in the conversation. So are you worried that within those 94 calls to action, are you worried that there are some that are going to get skipped over or perhaps be forgotten as time wears on?
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with each and every one of you. I think, for me as a young Métis Esqueo, I think we have a lot of work to do. And I think for me, as time goes on, I don't think, because the calls to action were formed directly from the survivors, from the stories of the survivors. And I don't think that that's something that can ever be forgotten. I think as time goes on, as in our realities continue to change, our lived experiences continue to change, I think they can adapt, they can grow, and we can build on them. But I think we owe it to survivors to never allow them to be forgotten.
Darian, I'm curious, your perspective, from a legal perspective, do you look at those 94 calls to action and see, perhaps as Canada's lawyers would be looking at them, and think, what are some ones that we would want to kind of maybe forget about?
Well,
because I'm sure there are some.
Forgetting the recommendations. No, I don't think that any of them should actually be forgotten or overshadowed. I know Canada would like to disagree with all of them and say none of it should happen because they want to reduce their debt load, they want to reduce their finances, to really get rid of this Indian problem. I don't think that's really changed in our history. But I don't think that the calls will be forgotten so long as there's intergenerational trauma and there's survivors that are living through with that. I think that as long as these important investments and these important structural changes haven't been made, then the spirit of the calls to action will continue to live on, and will actually grow and grow and grow until there's such a movement in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities that change is required by governments of the day.
I like that everybody so far is seemingly hopeful that there isn't something that's just going to... I'm a lot older than all of you. I have a little more jaded perspective on it. Michael, I wanted to ask you that same question. Do you feel that there are calls to action that are going to be forgotten as time goes on?
Mine or a worry. Myself, I am a little bit older as well, and being raised by residential school survivors, a lot of their stories that I heard on the daily, was something that I grew up with. And when this all came to light, to me, it was like, oh yeah, I've been hearing this since I was a child. So to me, I do have concern that there may be the entire 94 calls that may be forgotten or brushed aside, just like as our treaties were not upheld to the fullest. So I think it's our responsibility within each of those calls to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable.
So that's a good point too, to think of of how much Canada means in terms of what they suggest they want to do in terms of the calls to action, and then we can look and see what that meant in terms of treaties. There's maybe reason to be suspicious, I suppose. Tenche, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you're worried about, those calls to action? Is there something you think is going to get swept under the rug, will just get lost in time?
I think one important thing to note is that, for non-Indigenous Canadians is that, you know, the residential school trauma doesn't end with the residential school survivors, you know, those who actually went through that residential school system. You know, I mentioned how Indigenous youth are the fastest growing population in Canada, but they are also intergenerational residential school survivors.
Right.
So we carry that trauma, you know, as a daughter and a granddaughter of two matriarchs who went to residential school. That trauma lives within me. And because of that, Indigenous young people in this country are not going to let those calls to action be swept under the rug, because, you know, that trauma does not end with those residential school survivors. It lives on. And I'm very hopeful and very confident that, you know, the incredible young leaders that exist, you know, who are on this panel even, are not going to let that happen.
I thank all of you for taking the time to join us today to share your thoughts. It's always great to hear from our youth leaders, and kind of buoy our spirits as we look forward. I think a lot of times especially in media, we spend a lot of times bashing what's not happening and what we think is going to go wrong. And so then when we hear these fresh voices and optimism, it's we owe you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mercy,
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we are going to take a look back now at the TRC event that was held in Ottawa 5 years ago today, just to refresh our minds about that landmark unveiling of the TRC's report into the legacy of Canada's residential school system.
It was an emotional day, but Justice Murray Sinclair did not let sorrow overshadow the truth.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission released 94 recommendations after hearing testimony from nearly 7,000 survivors. Some of the stories commissioners heard were hard to comprehend.
Most of the bodies of deceased children were never sent back to their home communities. Instead, they were buried at the schools, sometimes in schools that had no playgrounds but did have cemeteries.
Survivors packed a hotel ballroom, some overcome by emotion. They waited patiently to hear what the commissioners would recommend to heal the historical injustices.
Central to directing the path to reconciliation will be the Canadian government's adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
And another demand that seems to have fallen on deaf ears.
We believe that not all that needs to be known is known about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in this country. We therefore call for the establishment of a national inquiry to look into that cause.
The Commission also made education a top priority.
To this end, we call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators, to create curricula on residential schools where it does not yet exist, and on treaties, and on Aboriginal people's historical and contemporary contributions to Canada. All of this a mandatory education requirement for all students.
The Commission says at least 3,200 children died in residential schools, but they believe the number is double that. And Sinclair says those who did survive were stripped of their identity.
Children became unable to answer questions as simple as, where do I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? And who am I?
Despite the gloom and horror stories, Commissioner Littlechild offered a glimmer of hope.
There was an attempt to destroy our culture. Our cultural events and ceremonies were prohibited. We were abused for using our own languages. But if we are to heal, we must return to spirituality.
Winnipeg has Canada's largest urban Indigenous population, and on that landmark day 5 years ago today, hundreds gathered in this city. The first national event the TRC held actually took place in Winnipeg back in 2010. Here's a look back at another story by APTN's Dennis Ward of that landmark day.
Today was part of Anne Thomas Callahan's healing journey. She spent 14 years at the Indian Residential School in Birtle, Manitoba, but she was determined to put those years behind her.
Reconciliation, I guess that term means different things to other people. Reconciling, I think a person has to reconcile with his or herself first.
The release of the Truth and Reconciliations report is just the beginning. That was the common sentiment at this gathering in Winnipeg, where there were calls to tackle ongoing issues like violence against women and the child welfare system.
Let's make changes in this lifetime so that our children and our grandchildren don't have to have another Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 40 or 50 years from now to talk about what's going on today in CFS. Let's make the difference now.
There was a lot of applause here in Winnipeg as some of the calls to action were read out in Ottawa. Many here say the implementation of those recommendations are critical.
It's not up for us as Aboriginal people to start teaching Canadians about this. They have to have the spirit to start learning, and it's upon them to learn about what went on historically and what is going on today, and to make those changes.
Hundreds of people walked down the busiest street in the province during the lunch hour in a walk of reconciliation. Winnipeg will play a major role in the future of the TRC. The National Research Centre is located here and will be home to thousands of recorded statements from those affected by the schools and their legacy, millions of photographs and documents, and all future materials that are gathered. Dennis Ward, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Joining us now, our panelist discussion here to discuss their perspective on how non-Indigenous Canada has progressed or not since that landmark Truth and Reconciliation report. Caro Lupfi is the Executive Director of Apathy is Boring. Her organization works in a nonpartisan manner on a national scale to engage Canadian youth in democracy. Caro is named one of the top 25 women of influence in Canada in 2020. And also joining us is Kyle Hill. He's currently in Anchorage, Alaska, and is the co-founder of Teach for Canada. Are you guys both there?
Yes.
Caro,
yes,
Kyle, thank you so much for joining us. We're waiting for another guest to join us, and hopefully we can connect with him, technology being what it is right now. But we'll get started. I wanted to start, Caro, we'll start with you. What were your thoughts as a non-Indigenous person when the TRC report came out? We just were talking to an Indigenous youth panel about their perspective. I'm very curious every time I ask this question of a non-Indigenous person when it came out.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. I think it was a really important moment for us as Canadians. As a non-Indigenous person, it was a call to go through a process of unlearning the history that we've been taught, and to do that learning in partnership with our Indigenous friends, our Indigenous elders, and to take on the responsibility of educating our communities and taking on that work as well. So it was a call to action for all of us, and for myself, I took that very seriously, and we brought that into the organization as well.
I like that. Kyle, I have the same question for you as a non-Indigenous person. When the TRC report came out, do you remember how you felt on that day 5 years ago today?
I do. I remember being incredibly moved and impressed at the amount of work and attention that the TRC received. That Senator Sinclair, I guess Justice Sinclair at the time, was saying as in his speeches in Ottawa, and as Cara said, as a non-Indigenous person, I remember thinking that there's obviously a lot of work to go around, but part of the privilege that I hold and that non-Indigenous people hold is the ability to influence communities within our sphere of influence that may not have had the same feelings or had the same exposure to the TRC.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, and somebody from our panel just before you guys joined us had mentioned they got a sense that Canadians felt almost shocked to learn what their country, this country that most Canadians feel it's kind of a shining light of human rights, a human rights leader in this world, and were shocked when this whole report came out and unpacked that chunk of Canada's history. I wanted to ask, so we'll go back to you, Caro. Do you think that your community understands just the capacity of our history and why reconciliation is important?
Mm-hmm. I think there's still a lot of people that don't understand. I think there's still a lot of work ahead of us. But I would also say, I think for non-Indigenous people, there's a degree of it to which we will never fully understand the trauma and the pain that happened. And so part of it is recognizing, what it is we will never fully understand, and committing to being allies in this journey of reconciliation, and stepping back when it's no longer our place, and being humble about what it is we don't know.
It'd be nice if we had more people who shared that exact thought and perspective on it. Kyle, I would ask you the same question. Do you feel that your community, that Canadians in general, grasp the magnitude of what happened to Indigenous people and understand why reconciliation is important, and the steps, what they can do to reconcile?
Well, I think they understand it a lot more now than they did 10 years ago, but as Cara said, there's a lot of work to go. I sometimes use my own family and friends from rural Nova Scotia or throughout Nova Scotia as a benchmark. And when I started working with Indigenous communities in the north back in around 2012, 2013, a lot of people back home and a lot of people said, oh, why? What's going on up there? Is there something that I don't know? 10 years later or 8, 9 years later, now there's much more awareness. There's much more knowledge than there was. But unpacking white privilege is hard. Unpacking colonization is hard. People often put up real defenses or barriers, and so it takes a lot of painstaking time and effort to really get in there. And it's happening. It's happening in houses and in restaurants and in conference halls across the country, but it is a decades-long process, not just a couple of years. Yeah,
I guess, it feels like it's been longer than 5 years, but we do have to remember it has only been 5 years. This was a big a news, which was sort of shocking news to a lot of Canadians, and it trickled out, so the change will be slower than probably we'd all like it to be. And thank you guys for joining us to remind us of that, and to remind Canadians what their roles are as we continue this path towards reconciliation. Thank you guys both for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So let's take a look back at what the TRC report meant to youth when it was unveiled. Here's Annette Francis, who was reporting at a reconciliation gathering that day in Ottawa 5 years ago.
As a fitting tribute to the survivors of residential schools, the opening ceremony began with the big drum and hand drum songs from the smallest, most sacred gifts. Then a quick history lesson from the chair of the TRC and a message to his young audience.
You are the agents of change, you in this room, because you are the future leaders of this country. You are the ones who are going to take over those positions of leadership in the future. You are the ones who are going to guide this country along the road to reconciliation.
Following the opening speeches, the students split up for various workshops. They take part in activities to teach them the impacts of colonization and residential schools. 10-year-old Jenna Hogg is one of 2,000 elementary and high school students participating in today's event. She describes what she's learned.
I think it was like torture, because our principal showed a picture of what one kid looked like before they went to residential schools, and they were really embracing like their culture. And then when they were done, they were just like a child who doesn't look like they know anything about who they actually are.
And according to another student, the messages he learned throughout the day were powerful.
For some people, they don't have cultures, but it's not fair that people can pick on them for different cultures, so it's just being fair to other people.
This survivor is impressed by what he's seeing. He commends the work of the TRC and says education days like this are important because there are many more untold stories.
Like Truth and Reconciliation is 7 generations from now. Not myself, but their grandchildren, or their great-grandchildren. Today, education is a pebble in the pond. It's the ripple effect. But we as survivors are not just throwing a little pebble. We're literally throwing a big boulder to make the government wake up.
As Education Day comes to an end, the TRC and survivors encourage more events like this across the country to educate and support healing and reconciliation. Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Would love to have had some of those children from that story on here joining us today, 5 years later, what they think. But joining us now is Max Finde. He is a member of the Sweetgrass First Nation in Saskatchewan on Treaty 6 territory. He's currently serving as Executive Director of Canadian Roots Exchange, a recognized leader in the delivery of reconciliation programming to Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth across this country. Max is passionate about training the next generation of youth leaders and understanding how to make change and increasing access to traditional ceremonies for Indigenous youth. Max, thank you so much for joining us today.
Nanaskaman, Melissa, it's great to be here with you.
5 years, does it feel to you that it's been that long?
You know, I think this time has gone by very quickly for this country in some ways, and in other ways, things haven't moved quick enough. I think a lot today about the strength and the bravery of those who survived residential school and their families, descendants, children, grandchildren, who have done the hard work, who've done the heavy lifting for us. And now it's our responsibility as a country and those who are committed to doing this work that's called reconciliation to give life to their stories, to their efforts to make a better Canada.
Is enough being done to live up to the spirit of the calls to action?
Well, I think a lot about what we're seeing in the world today, the pain that exists today, the discrimination that exists today, the hardship that still is felt across this country. I'm not talking just about Indigenous people, but we see this powerful movement for the valuing of Black lives. Black Lives Matter. Yeah. We saw just last week a young Afro-Indigenous woman who lost her life in Toronto. I'm thinking about how these moments and these movements intersect with one another. I think we still have so much work to do. And there are folks like Canadian Roots Exchange who are working meaningfully with our young people. And, I get the great pleasure of listening to the voices and the visions of Indigenous and non-Indigenous young people every day. And what I hear from them the most is that they hope and they wish for solidarity. They hope and they wish for allyship. They hope and they wish for us to recognize that my well-being is connected to yours and is connected to other communities, other constituencies, and other groups who face oppression in this country. I think, as much as this day is about recognizing and supporting survivors, it's also for us to think about how can we make sure that we're not perpetuating racism or anti-Blackness or making more hardship that we know so well in our communities.
If for the survivors that are still with us, who might be watching today, what would you want to say to them 5 years outside of what they went through the testimony that went into this report and the path of reconciliation that's been taken? What words would you want to say to those survivors who are watching or listening?
Nananaskuma. I thank them and I have loved them. They've done so much and they have lived through so much that we cannot begin to know. I want the survivors of residential school to know that we are working hard to make sure that their voices are respected. I want them to know that our work is to make sure that this never happens again. I want them to know that things are going to be okay. That in my work, I see so many Indigenous young people who are brimming with pride for who they are, growing their hair long and wearing these beautiful beadwork and medallions, other cultural things, people who are coming back to ceremony, coming back to identity, coming back to who we are as Nihiwa, as Anishinaabe people, as Métis people, and that their suffering and their storytelling of what happened wasn't for nothing, and that we're going to be okay.
Thanks for that, Max. Those are great words, and I hope that a lot of people take that. The intergenerational trauma that people have suffered, that families have gone through, I hope that those words are taken into their hearts, so thanks. APTN was included in the Truth and Reconciliation Report in calls to action number 85, which reads, "We call upon the Aboriginal People's Television Network as an independent, non-profit broadcaster with programming by, for, and about Aboriginal people to support reconciliation, including but not limited to continuing to provide leadership in programming and organizational culture that reflects the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Aboriginal people, and continuing to develop media initiatives that inform and educate the Canadian public and connect Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians." We here at APTN, I can assure you, take that very seriously. Well, our reconciliation checkup, looking at how things have changed or not in the 5 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Report, what needs to happen next. Huge thanks to our incredible panelists for sharing their thoughts and insight, and to Canadian Roots Exchange for helping to make this happen. Be sure to tune in to APTN National News tonight for more on the TRC's 5th anniversary. I'm your host, Melissa Ridgen. Thanks for joining, and I leave you with a final message from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
The TRC gave reconciliation a voice and moved the needle in a way a lot of us never expected.
Reconciliation means to me adequate funding for education for Indigenous youth, clean drinking water on reservations, as well as keeping our women and our children safe.
My hope for the future generations to come is to see more Indigenous role models, younger people reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their identity, go out and learn and be a part of the community.
We need to slow down and really elevate the word healing, and that a lot of conversation needs to happen between us and Indigenous people.
We do not have time to be divided, to blame, shame, harm, or give up.
Reconciliation.
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 We all must take an active role and actually answer the TRC's calls to action.